Picture a mountain of metal and stone stretching kilometers into a poisoned sky. Imagine billions of human souls packed into this vertical city. This monument to humanity's dominance over a world long since stripped of anything natural or pure. This is a hive world in the Imperium of man. And understanding what it was before the Orks came as essential to grasping the full horror of what happens when the green tide arrives. Hive worlds are among the most populous planets in the Imperium, with approximately 32,000 of these megacities scattered across the galaxy. Each hive is a self-contained arcology, a city that houses anywhere from millions to billions of people stacked in layers that can rise 8, 10, even 15 kilometers above the planet's ruined surface. These massive structures have been built up over thousands of years, sometimes dating back to the dark age of technology, with each generation adding new levels atop the old, creating a geological record of human habitation written in rockcrete and adamantium. The structure of a typical hive tells you everything about imperial society in miniature. At the very top, piercing through the toxic cloud cover into relatively clean air, are the spires. Here dwell the planetary nobility, the merchant princes, the industrial magnates, and visiting dignitaries from across the Imperium. These levels are spacious, well lit, and breathe actual fresh air imported from Agri, worlds light years away. The residents eat real food, not the reconstituted protein paste that feeds the masses below. They see natural sunlight and live in a luxury that would be unrecognizable to those in the levels beneath their feet. Below the spires lies the upper hive, home to the bureaucrats who actually run the hive day to day, the senior manufacturer managers, the middle echelons of the adeptus administratum, and various important functionaries. Life here is comfortable by imperial standards. Power flows freely, space is not at a premium, and while the air is recycled, it has only passed through a few thousand lungs before reaching you. These are the middle and middle classes of the Imperium. Those who have clawed their way above the masses, but haven't quite broken through to true nobility. Then comes the bulk of the hive, the massive middle sections where tens or hundreds of millions live and work in conditions that would horrify anyone from a civilized world. Here are the vast hab blocks, residential sectors where families are crammed into spaces barely large enough to lie down in. The working class of the hive lives here, their entire existence devoted to whatever vocation they were born into, whether in the manufactorums producing goods for the imperial tithe, or maintaining the countless systems that keep the hive functioning. The air at these levels has been recycled so many times it tastes metallic and acrid. Natural light is a memory from history lessons. Everything is lit by flickering lumens and phosphor strips. Food is manufactured in vast vat complexes, algae-based protein pastes, corpse starch reclaimed from the dead, synthetic nutrients that provide the minimum calories needed to keep a worker functional. Water is distilled from the runoff of the levels above, treated and retreated until it barely resembles water at all. Deeper still lies the underhive, those levels that have been abandoned to entropy and darkness. Here, the hive's structure becomes dangerous, with collapsed domes, crumbling foundations, and entire sectors that have fallen into ruin. This is the domain of gangs, mutants, criminals, and those who have fallen through the cracks of imperial society. No laws reach here except those enforced by whoever has the most guns and the will to use them. The underhive is perpetually dark, lit only by stolen lumens and chemical fires, filled with toxic fumes and radioactive waste that seeps down from above. Mutants thrive here, their bodies twisted by generations of exposure to pollutants and forbidden technologies. At the very bottom, below even the underhive, is the sump, a vast lake of radioactive sludge and chemical waste that has accumulated over millennia. This toxic ocean sits at the base of the hive, and things live there. Creatures so mutated and horrible that they barely register as having once been human or even orkoid. Occasionally, these monsters make their way up into the lower levels. But mostly they remain in their poisonous domain, a reminder that there are depths of horror even the underhive's denizens fear to contemplate. The average citizen of a hive will never leave the level they were born on. They might not even leave their hab sector in their entire life. They work the same job their parents worked, in the same manufactorum, producing the same widgets or weapons or chemicals that their grandparents produced. The concept of social mobility is laughable. You are born into your station and you die in it, and if you are very fortunate, your children will do the same rather than falling into the underhive or dying in some industrial accident. Time in the hive is marked not by the rising and setting of a sun most will never see, but by work shifts that can last 18 or 20 hours. Rest periods are brief and uncomfortable, spent in hab units that might house an entire family in a space no larger than a storage closet on a more civilized world. Privacy is a concept that simply does not exist for the vast majority of hive dwellers. You live, work, eat, and sleep surrounded by millions of other humans. The press of humanity and constant physical reality. The hive relies utterly on imports to survive. Food, water purification chemicals, raw materials. Everything must be brought in from elsewhere in the star system or beyond. A hive cut off from trade for even a few weeks faces catastrophic starvation. The population is simply too vast to support itself on what little the poisoned world outside the hive walls can provide. This dependence makes hive worlds simultaneously vital to the Imperium's economy and incredibly vulnerable to disruption. What the hive does produce is manufacturing output on a scale that beggars imagination. Countless millions labor in the manufactorums, producing everything from simple tools to sophisticated weapons to vehicle components. The industrial capacity of a single hive world can supply entire sectors of the Imperium. This makes them crucial to the imperial war machine, which in turn makes them targets. The enemies of mankind know that striking a hive world means disrupting production that feeds 100 other worlds. Religion permeates every aspect of hive life. The imperial cult is everywhere, from the massive cathedrals in the upper hive to the street. Corner shrines where workers pause for brief prayers between shifts. The emperor is worshipped as the god of mankind, and faith in him is the glue that holds the Imperium together. For the common hive worker, faith offers the only comfort in a life of endless toil, the promise that their suffering has meaning, that they serve the emperor by their labor, and that perhaps in death they will find the peace that life denies them. The Adeptus Arbits maintain order through overwhelming force. Their fortress precincts are scattered throughout the hive, islands of brutal law enforcement in a sea of humanity. Arbitrators are judge, jury and executioner, their word is law, and their punishments are harsh and immediate. The threat of being sent to a penal legion or simply executed on the spot keeps most citizens in line. Reinforced by the ever-present servo, skulls and surveillance systems that monitor the hive's passages and public spaces. Defense of the hive falls to the Planetary Defense Force, or PDF, recruited from the hive's own population. These are not elite soldiers, they are workers given lasguns and basic training, expected to defend their home if needed, but primarily serving to maintain order and garrison key locations. Many PDF troopers have never fired their weapons except in training. They drill in the rare hours between shifts, learning basic tactics and how to hold a line. Most hope they will never need to use these skills. The outside of the hive, what little surface exists between the great cities, is called the ash wastes or dead zones or toxic plains, depending on the world. Millennia of unregulated industrial output has rendered these areas deadly to unprotected human life. The air will kill you, the water will kill you, the very soil is poisonous. Some hives are surrounded by radioactive deserts, others by jungles choked with toxic plants, still others by frozen wastelands scoured by acid rain. Whatever the environment, it is hostile and uninhabitable, a monument to how thoroughly humanity has ruined the worlds it claims. This is what a hive world is on a normal day. A vertical hellscape where billions toil in conditions that would be considered intolerable anywhere else, grinding out their lives in service to an Imperium that barely acknowledges their existence. It is grim, it is dark, it is a life of suffering and toil with precious little joy or hope. And then the Orks arrive, and everything gets so much worse. The first signs of doom, the astropaths felt it first. though they could not name what they felt. A disturbance in the warp, something vast and hungry and gleeful pressing against the veil of reality. Those psychers who maintained the psychic communications that bound the Imperium together began experiencing visions of green, skinned monsters and oceans of blood. Some went mad, screaming about a tide of violence washing over everything. The authorities dismissed these ravings as the usual hazards of working with the warp, touched. But the astropaths knew something terrible approached. Then the augurs picked up the signal. Something massive had translated from the warp at the edge of the star system. A contact so enormous it could not possibly be a natural phenomenon. Fleet Command scrambled to identify the intruder, their Vox channels crackling with demands for identification and threats of immediate destruction if the contact did not respond. But the thing did not respond, not with words. It simply began to move, accelerating toward the inner system with a speed that should have been impossible for something its size. As it drew closer, the augurs resolved the contact into its true forms, a space hulk, one of those nightmare amalgamations of ships that sometimes emerge from the warp. Dozens or hundreds of vessels fused together by the insane energies of that hellish realm. This one was particularly massive, a conglomeration of Ork vessels. Imperial ships lost to history, Xenos craft of unknown origin, and things that might once have been space stations or asteroids, all welded into a single grotesque mass several kilometers across. The planetary governor convened his war council. The space hulk was officially declared derelict and claimed by the Imperium for salvage rights. This was standard procedure, a legal fiction that allowed salvage companies to strip the hulk for valuable technology and materials. The governor, a corpulent man who had inherited his position and never seen combat in his life, declared that the hulk's arrival was actually fortunate. Think of the riches that could be extracted from such a find. Think of the increase in tithe production once they reclaimed the technologies within. The PDF was put on alert, more as a formality than any real preparation. A few senior officers, veterans of actual combat, tried to argue for higher readiness, pointing out that space hulks were notorious for carrying all manner of dangerous things, from Janess dealers to chaos cults to, yes, Orks. But the governor would not hear such pessimism. The Hive had defense lasers, orbital platforms, a small flotilla of system defense craft. They were perfectly safe. The people in the lower levels heard rumors of something happening, whispers that spread through the hab, blocks and manufactorums. But rumors were constant in the Hive. Every day brought new stories of impending doom or salvation or visitation by the Emperor himself. Most workers ignored the talk, as they ignored everything that did not directly affect their immediate survival. They had quotas to meet, shifts to work, and families to feed. Whatever was happening in orbit was the concern of people far above their station. The first orbital bombardment came without warning. The space hulk had drifted into high orbit, seemingly inert, when suddenly its prow lit up with weapons fire. Massive projectiles, crude but devastating, slammed into the orbital defense platforms, smashing through void shields and armor plating like they were paper. The platforms returned fire, their lance batteries and macro cannons scoring hits across the hulk's surface, but it was like shooting at a mountain. For every weapon they destroyed, the hulk had 10 more. Within hours, the orbital defenses were reduced to expanding clouds of debris and burning corpses. The system defense fleet moved to engage, their captains knowing this was likely a suicide run, but bound by duty and the knowledge that if they did not stop the hulk here, it would be loose among the planet's orbital infrastructure. They died bravely, their ships torn apart by salvos of Ork rockets and crude but massive cannon fire. A few managed to ram the hulk, their plasma drives detonating in desperate attempts to cripple the invader, but the space hulk absorbed the damage and kept coming. As the last defense ship died in a flash of annihilating light, the space hulk positioned itself in geosynchronous orbit directly above the planet's main Hive cluster. Then it began to launch its payload. Dozens, then hundreds of smaller craft detached from the hulk's surface. Crude landing vessels and assault boats that looked like they had been welded together from scrap metal and prayer. These were Ork rocks, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with massive rockets and force fields, each one carrying thousands of greenskin warriors. The rocks screamed through the atmosphere, their passage leaving trails of fire across the sky that could be seen even through the pollution-choked clouds. Defense lasers from the Hive cities opened fire, burning some of the rocks out of the sky, their shattered remains creating massive craters in the ash wastes. But there were too many, far too many, and the lasers could only kill so many before the rocks activated their force fields. Shimmering barriers of barely understood technology that deflected the worst of the defensive fire. People in the upper levels could see the rocks falling like burning stars, dozens of them converging on their Hive city. For a moment, there was disbelief, a refusal to accept what their eyes were showing them. Then panic hit like a physical wave, spreading through the habitation levels and manufacturums. Workers abandoned their posts, flooding into the corridors in a desperate attempt to reach somewhere, anywhere that might be safer. Overseers screamed orders that went ignored, and in some places, riots broke out as people fought each other for access to evacuation routes that did not exist. The planetary governor sealed himself in his fortified command center deep in the heart of the administrative sector, surrounded by PDF troops and automated defense systems. He demanded reports from his subordinates, ranting about how this was impossible, how the Orks could not have breached the defenses so easily. His advisors tried to explain that the reports were coming in, that Orks were landing all across the planet's surface, that the Hive cities were about to be attacked by what appeared to be a WH of unprecedented size. In the Middle Hive, those who had access to Vox channels heard the PDF commanders trying to coordinate a defense. But the PDF was not ready for this. Most of their soldiers were scattered across the Hive in small garrison posts, equipped for riot control and maintaining order among the civilian population, not for repelling a massive Xenos invasion. Officers screamed contradictory orders, demanding that units move to reinforce positions that had already been overrun, or hold choke points that had not yet been threatened. The first rock struck the Hive with the force of a strategic bomb. It slammed into the upper manufacturum levels on the Hive's western face, its crude force field absorbing much of the impact, but still creating a crater hundreds of meters across. The shock wave shattered windows for kilometers, sent massive cracks running through the Hive's structural supports, and killed thousands in an instant from the sheer kinetic energy of the impact. Before the dust could settle, the rock split open like a grotesque egg, and from its interior poured a horde of green, skinned warriors, their bellowing war cries audible even over the groaning of tortured metal and the screams of the injured. The Orks had arrived, and the true nightmare was just beginning. The green tide arrives, the Orks that spilled from the crashed rocks were unlike anything most Hive citizens had ever seen. Even in the lurid illustrations of the Imperial primer or the propaganda posters warning of Xenos threats, they stood taller than any human. Massive slabs of green muscle and crude armor, their tusked faces split by grins of pure savage joy. They carried weapons that looked like they had been assembled from scrap metal and scavenged parts, oversized guns that should not have worked but spat bullets with lethal efficiency, and crude choppers, axes, and hammers designed for brutal close combat. Orks are a species that exists solely for war. They do not build civilizations in any recognizable sense. They do not create art or pursue knowledge for its own sake. They do not form lasting diplomatic relationships or trade agreements. They fight, and when there are no other enemies to fight, they fight each other. This is not a matter of culture or choice. It is hardwired into their very biology. Orks grow larger and stronger the more they fight, starting as runty boys, barely taller than a human, and potentially growing into massive war bosses that can stand 3 meters tall and possess strength enough to tear a man apart with their bare hands. The greenskins reproduce through a spore-based system, shedding microscopic fungal spores throughout their lives, and especially at the moment of death. These spores, if left unchecked, will eventually grow into new Orks, starting small and maturing rapidly in a process that sees them emerge from the ground already adolescent and aggressive, possessing instinctive knowledge of their own brutal language and how to fight. This makes orcs almost impossible to completely eradicate from a world once they have established a presence. Even if you kill every orc on a planet, if you do not burn every last spore, new ones will eventually emerge. What the Hive citizens did not know, could not know, was that orcs also possess a kind of collective psychic field they call the WH40K, named after their traditional war cry. This psychic gestal grows stronger as more orcs gather together, creating a feedback loop where the orcs' belief in their own strength and the inevitability of their victory actually makes it more likely. Orc technology, which should not work based on any rational understanding of physics, often functions simply because the orcs believe it will. Their ramshackle guns fire because the orcs think guns should go daka-daka. Their vehicles held together with rust and hope somehow manage to transport troops across battlefields. And their crude armor stops rounds that should penetrate it. The first encounters between the PDF and the orc invaders were brief and catastrophic. PDF units, many of them composed of workers who had been handed lasguns mere hours before and told to defend their section of the Hive, found themselves facing creatures from nightmare. The orcs laughed as they charged, a sound that combined genuine mirth with bloodlust, bellowing, WL, as they crashed into the hastily assembled defensive lines. Lasguns flashed, the standard issue weapon of the Imperium sending coherent beams of light into green flesh, burning through skin and muscle. Some orcs fell, their bodies collapsing in heaps of scorched meat. But many more simply kept coming, shrugging off wounds that would have killed a human, driven by pain tolerance that defied comprehension and a regenerative ability that allowed them to recover from injuries at a horrifying rate. Even orcs who should have been dead, their vital organs destroyed, would sometimes keep fighting for precious seconds more, long enough to cleave through another PDF trooper or two before finally collapsing. In close combat, there was no contest. The orcs' crude weapons, massive cleavers called choppers and enormous axes, smashed through flak armor like it was not there. PDF troopers died by the dozens, pulled apart or crushed or simply beaten to death by creatures that reveled in the carnage. The survivors broke and ran, falling back through the Hive's corridors in a disorganized rout, the sounds of orc laughter and the screams of the dying echoing behind them. Civilians caught in the initial assault zones had nowhere to run. The orcs surged through hab blocks and workers' quarters like a green tide, killing anyone they encountered with casual brutality. These were not systematic executions or calculated massacres. They were the simple result of orcs being what they are, creatures that live to fight and kill. Some citizens were simply gunned down as the orcs tested their weapons on convenient targets. Others were killed in melees as the greenskins charged through corridors, their choppers rising and falling with mechanical efficiency. But not all the orcs' victims died immediately. Some were taken, grabbed by massive green hands, and dragged back toward the landing zones, their screams ignored or worse, enjoyed by their captors. Orcs have uses for prisoners, none of them pleasant. The strongest might be forced to fight in orc blood sports, gladiatorial contests where humans battle each other, or even orcs for the greenskins' entertainment. Others might be put to work as slaves, forced to labor on orc fortifications or scavenge in dangerous areas. The unlucky might simply be used as target practice or test subjects for orc docs, bizarre medical experiments. The sheer noise of the orc invasion was overwhelming. The Hive had always been loud, the constant background roar of machinery and millions of voices creating a sonic environment that workers learned to tune out. But this was different. The orcs brought with them a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, bellowed war cries, and the grinding clatter of their crude vehicles. Their weapons made distinctive sounds. The rapid daka-daka-daka of their shooters, the deeper boom of their big shooters, the screaming whoosh of rockets launching, and above it all, the endless chant of "Nobody there!" Eek! The orcs also brought with them their Gretchen, smaller green-skinned creatures that served as slaves and cannon fodder for their larger cousins. These, grots, were cowardly and cunning, more intelligent than they appeared, and perfectly willing to stab you in the back if they thought they could get away with it. Gretchen swarmed through the lower levels, looting everything they could carry, squabbling among themselves over particularly shiny bits of scrap, and occasionally forming up in mobs to attack isolated humans with a combination of crude guns and sheer numbers. Within hours of the first rock impacts, whole sectors of the Hive were in Ork hands. The Greenskins established beachheads around their landing sites, tearing down walls to create fortified positions and beginning the process they excelled at: looting. Orks are obsessed with collecting scrap and salvage, everything from weapons and armor to vehicle parts to random bits of machinery. Mech boys, the Ork equivalent of engineers, immediately began sorting through the salvage, assembling new weapons and vehicles from the scavenged materials with a speed and inventiveness that seemed impossible. The planetary governor, watching grainy surveillance feeds from his bunker, refused to believe the scale of the catastrophe. He ordered his commanders to retake the lost sectors immediately, launching counterattacks with whatever forces they could muster. PDF units, many of them under strength and poorly equipped, were thrown into assaults against entrenched Ork positions. They died in droves, cut down by Ork firepower or torn apart, when the Greenskins surged out to meet their charges with gleeful enthusiasm. Some PDF units fought with genuine courage, holding defensive positions far longer than should have been possible, selling their lives dearly to buy time for civilians to evacuate deeper into the Hive. Officers who had never expected to see real combat found themselves making decisions that would haunt them forever if they lived long enough for forever to matter. Which sectors to abandon, which civilians to sacrifice, where to fall back to, how to make every death count for something. The Adeptus Arbites mobilized, their fortress precincts turning into bastions of resistance as arbitrators took to the streets in full battle gear. These were not poorly trained PDF troopers. They were hardened law enforcers equipped with the best weapons and armor the Imperium could provide to those who maintained order on its worlds. They met the Orks with disciplined volleys of fire, shotguns and bolters speaking with authority. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Greenskins faced enemies who did not immediately break and run. But even the Arbits were outnumbered and outgunned. For every Ork they killed, 3 more seemed to appear, drawn by the sound of fighting like sharks to blood. The arbitrators fell back by sections, maintaining fire discipline and covering each other's retreats, turning every intersection into a killing ground and making the Orks pay in blood for every meter they advanced. It was not enough to stop the green tide, but it bought time, and in a battle of this scale, time was the most precious commodity. In the upper levels, the noble houses activated their private armies. These were not PDF conscripts. They were professional soldiers, mercenaries and house guards who trained constantly and fought in the Underhive to maintain their skills. They moved to seal the transit points between the upper and middle hive, creating defensive lines meant to keep the Ork filth from reaching the spires. If the lower hive had to burn, so be it. The nobility would survive, and they would rebuild. For the common citizens, there was only confusion and terror. Vox channels carried contradictory information. Some channels screaming for evacuation, others ordering people to remain in their HAB units, still others broadcasting nothing but static or worse, the sounds of combat and dying. Families huddled together in the dark as the lights flickered and died, the hive's power grid damaged by the rock impacts and the fighting. The air recycling systems began to fail in some sectors, leaving the inhabitants gasping in increasingly stale and toxic air. This was only the beginning. The Orks had landed, yes, but they had not yet begun their main offensive. They were still disembarking from their rocks, still gathering their forces and organizing into the warbands that would assault the hive proper. The true nightmare of an Ork invasion, the grinding warfare that could last months or years, was yet to come. The upper spires under siege. When the first reports of Ork landings reached the spires, the reaction among the nobility was not fear but outrage. How dare these Xenos filth threaten the spires themselves? Did they not know who resided here? The noble houses. Those ancient bloodlines that could trace their lineage back thousands of years, whose wealth could buy and sell entire planetary systems, whose connections reached into the highest echelons of the administratum and even to terror itself. The reality of the threat took some time to sink in. The nobility had lived insulated lives at the literal top of society, their existence one of comfort and privilege that the masses below could barely imagine. They had dealt with threats before, of course. Underhive gangs that grew too powerful and needed to be crushed, rival houses that required political maneuvering, or occasionally, discreet assassination, workers' revolts that needed to be suppressed with maximum brutality to discourage future unrest. But an actual military invasion by a xenospecies, this was unprecedented in living memory. The noble houses responded as they always had, by turning to their private armies. Every major house maintained a force of house guards, trained soldiers equipped with the best weapons money could buy. These were not conscripts or volunteers serving out of duty. They were professionals who made their living by violence, recruited from the underhive gangs, off-world mercenary companies, or even discharged guard veterans. They were loyal to their houses because the pay was excellent and the alternatives were death or worse. The spires transformed from pleasure palaces to fortresses in a matter of hours. Heavy weapon emplacements rose from hidden alcoves. Void shield generators powered up to create shimmering barriers over the most critical structures, and kill zones were established at every access point. The nobility's architectural indulgences, the soaring atriums and crystal gardens, the grand halls and observation decks, all became potential battlefields. Balconies converted to firing positions and statuary rearranged to provide cover. The transit lifts and mag rail systems that connected the spires to the levels below were shut down and barricaded. If the Orks wanted to reach the upper levels, they would have to fight their way up through kilometers of fortified corridors and stairwells, every step contested by defenders who knew the terrain intimately. The nobility intended to turn their hive into a vertical meat grinder, spending the lives of everyone below them to preserve their own safety. The noble houses also activated their orbital assets. Several houses maintained their own small fleets, armed merchant vessels and private yachts that were surprisingly well armed for civilian craft. These ships moved to engage the Ork space hope, their captains knowing this was likely suicide, but bound by contracts that were more binding than chains. They died well, some of them, managing to damage portions of the Hoke before Ork firepower overwhelmed them. In the council chambers where the houses normally squabbled over trade rights and political influence, an emergency conclave was called. The discussion was heated and brief. Some houses wanted to evacuate immediately, to board their ships and flee to other worlds, where they could live in comfort and safety while the hive burned. Others argued for staying and fighting, pointing out that if the hive fell, their wealth and status would mean nothing. They would be refugees at the mercy of other noble houses who would not hesitate to take advantage of their weakness. In the end, greed won out over wisdom. The noble houses could not bear to abandon their accumulated wealth, the artifacts and heirlooms, the treasuries and manufactories, all the physical manifestations of their power and prestige. They would stay and defend what was theirs, and if the lower classes had to die to ensure that defense, well, that was what the lower classes were for. The first Ork units to reach the approaches to the spires were met with a level of resistance they had not yet encountered. House guards in carapace armor, some even wearing powered armor that was nearly the equal of Imperial Guard stormtroopers, opened fire with Helguns and heavy bolters. The Orks, used to smashing through poorly equipped PDF units, found themselves facing enemies who could actually hurt them. Las beams set to maximum power punching through their tough hide, and bolter rounds blowing them apart in showers of gore. But the Orks were not discouraged. If anything, they were delighted. These humies could actually put up a fight. This was proper scrappin', not like those other gits who ran away or died too easy. The Orks responded by bringing up their own heavy weapons, big shooters and rockets that hammered the defensive positions with overwhelming firepower. The house guards took casualties, expensive and difficult, to replace soldiers blown apart or cut down by the weight of fire, but they held their ground. The battles for control of the upper approaches became some of the most intense fighting in the early days of the invasion. The corridors that led from the middle hive to the upper levels were natural choke points. Narrow passages where the Orks' numerical advantage meant less and defenders could channel the assault into kill zones. Automatic turrets cycled through thousands of rounds, creating curtains of fire that shredded the first waves of attackers, while house guard snipers with long, las rifles picked off Ork leaders and heavy weapon crews. The Orks adapted, as they always did. Mech boys built crude but effective siege engines, massive shields made from scrap metal that could withstand even heavy bolter fire, pushed forward by dozens of Gretchen while Ork boys followed in their wake. Tank busters, Orks who specialized in destroying enemy vehicles and fortifications, fired rockets into defensive positions, the explosions collapsing walls and creating breaches that assault troops could exploit. Some Ork warbands tried alternative routes, forcing their way into the hive's service tunnels and maintenance shafts, attempting to flank the main defensive lines. They found these passages trapped and mined, the noble houses having spent considerable resources on ensuring every possible approach was covered. Gretchen were sent ahead to trigger the traps, their deaths clearing the way for the boys who followed, a brutal but effective tactic that slowly ground through the defenses. The nobility watched the fighting from their command centers, safe behind layers of security and void shields, observing through surveillance feeds and receiving reports from their house guard commanders. They saw their soldiers fighting and dying to protect them, and they nodded in satisfaction. This was exactly what these mercenaries were paid for. The houses began calculating the cost of replacing their losses, already thinking about which underhive gangs they could recruit from to replenish their ranks. But some among the nobility began to have doubts. The Orks were not breaking against the defenses. They were learning and adapting, bringing up more forces and trying new tactics. The Greenskins seemed to have an endless supply of troops, and every defensive position that fell saw more Orks pouring through, getting closer to the spires proper. How long could the defenses hold? Days, weeks, and what happened when the defensive lines finally broke? A few houses chose discretion over valor. In the dead of night, while the fighting raged in the levels below, they boarded their private ships and fled the system, abandoning their holdings and their people without a second thought. Other houses noted this betrayal and immediately moved to seize the evacuees' properties, sending their own troops to occupy the abandoned spires and claim what they could. Even in the midst of an existential threat, the nobility could not stop pursuing profit and power. The PDF commanders, watching entire HAB sectors burn while the nobility hoarded resources in the upper levels, began to feel a bitter resentment building. Their soldiers were dying to protect people who saw them as expendable trash, fighting to preserve a social order that had given them nothing but exploitation and suffering. Some units simply deserted, their soldiers melting away into the hive's depths rather than die for masters who cared nothing for them. Others stayed at their posts, motivated not by loyalty to the nobility, but by devotion to the emperor and a grim determination to defend their homes and families. The ecclesiarchy, the priesthood of the imperial cult, also mobilized. Preachers took to the streets, leading mobs of faithful in prayers and chants, whipping the population into a religious fervor. The priests promised that the emperor protected the faithful, that death in his service was the greatest honor, that the Orks were a test sent to prove humanity's worthiness. Some believed these words and found courage in them. Others recognized them as the lies they were, but went along because faith was all they had left. Miracle workers appeared, claiming to perform acts of divine intervention, healers who could supposedly cure the wounded with prayer, prophets who saw visions of imperial victory. Most were charlatans, but a few possessed genuine psychic abilities, minor psychers who had escaped detection and now used their powers to bolster morale, or in rare cases, actually manifested phenomena that seemed miraculous. The Inquisition would investigate these later, if anyone survived long enough for later to matter. In the spires themselves, life tried to continue normally. The nobility hosted dinner parties and social functions, dressed in their finest clothing and jewelry, dining on delicacies imported from across the Imperium. They discussed the invasion as if it were merely an inconvenient business matter, something their subordinates would handle. The sounds of fighting were distant and easily ignored, when you were surrounded by thick walls and void shields, when you could retreat into wine and pleasure, and pretend the world was not ending just kilometers below your feet. But even in the spires, the reality could not be completely shut out. Servants whispered about relatives in the lower levels who had gone silent, their vox channels dead or filled with static. House guards returned from the fighting with haunted looks and tales of the Orks' savagery. The occasional power fluctuation or tremor from a distant explosion reminded everyone that the defenses, while holding, were not impregnable. The war for the upper levels continued, a grinding battle of attrition where every meter was bought with blood. The Orks pushed forward relentlessly, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible, while the defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew that if they fell, everything they had ever known would be consumed by the green tide. This was urban warfare at its most brutal, fought in corridors and stairwells, hab blocks and manufactorums, every space a potential battlefield. The Middle Hive becomes a war zone. The Middle Hive, home to billions of workers, became the primary battleground of the invasion. This was where the majority of the Hive's population lived and worked, where the manufactorums churned out goods for the imperial teeth, where the vast hab blocks housed families in cramped quarters. It was also where the Orks focused much of their assault, drawn by the density of targets and the promise of good fighting. For the workers of the Middle Hive, the invasion shattered what little routine and stability their lives possessed. One moment they were at their posts, operating heavy machinery or assembling components or performing any of the countless tasks that kept the Hive running. The next, the walls were shaking from explosions, alarms were wailing, and overseers were screaming contradictory orders about evacuating or staying at posts or reporting to muster points that might not even exist anymore. The manufactorums, those massive industrial complexes, where thousands labored in shifts that could last 20 hours or more, became fortified positions almost by accident. The heavy machinery provided excellent cover. The sturdy construction of the production floors could withstand significant damage, and the workers themselves, while not trained soldiers, knew every inch of their workplace and could use that knowledge to their advantage. What they lacked was weapons and any real understanding of military tactics. The PDF tried to organize the workers into militia units, handing out lasguns and flak armor to anyone who looked capable of using them. The training was minimal, often nothing more than, point this end at the Orks, pull the trigger, try not to die. Some workers took to it with grim determination, understanding that their survival depended on fighting. Others fled, hiding in the darkest corners of the manufactorums or attempting to reach their families in the hab blocks. Still others simply continued working, their minds unable to process the scale of what was happening, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of their labor, even as battle raged around them. When the Orks reached the manufactorums, they did not immediately destroy them. Instead, they recognized these places for what they were: sources of raw materials and salvage. Ork mechboys moved through the production floors with glee, identifying machinery that could be looted or repurposed, ordering Gretchen to dismantle and carry away everything of value. The workers who resisted were killed. Those who cowered or fled were mostly ignored, beneath the Orks' notice, as long as they did not interfere with the looting. The fighting in the manufactorums was chaotic and desperate. Workers turned soldiers fought from behind heavy machinery, using their knowledge of the production floor to set up ambushes and traps. They would trigger industrial equipment to fall on advancing Orks, release scalding steam from broken pipes, or collapse partially completed structures onto greenskin mobs. These tactics worked sometimes, killing orcs and buying time. But they also often killed the workers themselves, crushed under falling machinery, or burned by their own traps. The orcs loved it. This was proper fighting. With humies who used their surroundings and tried to be clever. It made the scrap more enjoyable, more like a real hunt than the shooting gallery the first landings had been. Orc boys would storm through the manufactorums, their war cries echoing off the high ceilings, smashing through defensive positions with brute force and overwhelming numbers. Behind them came the mech boys with their Gretchen helpers, scavenging everything that could be carried away. The hab, blocks surrounding the manufactorums, became death traps. These were massive residential structures, hundreds of levels of cramped living spaces stacked on top of each other, connected by narrow corridors and malfunctioning lifts. The PDF tried to establish defensive positions at key intersections, creating fallback points where they could channel orc assaults into kill zones. But the sheer density of the hab blocks worked against them. There were too many approaches, too many ways for the greenskins to infiltrate and outflank defensive positions. Families barricaded themselves in their hab units, piling furniture against doors and praying that the orcs would pass them by. Some did. The greenskins more interested in finding enemies to fight than bothering with locked doors and cowering civilians. But others broke through, either out of sheer destructive joy or because they heard sounds of life inside. What happened to the families trapped in those units was mercifully quick, most of the time. The orcs were many things, but they were not sadists. They killed with brutal efficiency and moved on to find more fighting. The children suffered most. Too young to understand what was happening, too small to run or hide effectively. They clung to parents who could not protect them and cried in terror at the sounds of battle and the sight of the green-skinned monsters. Some parents made terrible choices in those moments, choosing to end their children's lives quickly rather than let them fall into orc hands. Others fought desperately to protect their young, armed with nothing but kitchen knives and improvised clubs, and died bravely but futilely. The Hive's infrastructure began to fail under the strain of the fighting. Power grids, already overtaxed by the demands of the manufactorums and life support systems, started to collapse as key generators were damaged or destroyed. Entire sectors went dark, their inhabitants left in absolute blackness, broken only by the flash of gunfire and the glow of fires. The air recycling systems, damaged by explosions and neglected by maintenance workers who were either dead or fled, began to pump increasingly toxic air through the ventilation shafts. Water became scarce as the purification plants were captured or destroyed by the orcs. The little water that remained was hoarded jealously, guarded by armed gangs who would kill to protect their supply. Fights broke out over access to broken pipes that still leaked a trickle of contaminated liquid. Desperate people willing to risk disease and poisoning rather than die of thirst. The orcs, with their incredibly tough constitutions, simply drank from whatever sources they found and suffered no ill effects. Food supplies collapsed almost immediately. The Middle Hive depended on regular shipments from the agri, combines and food processing plants, and when those shipments stopped, millions began to starve. The PDF tried to organize rationing and distribution, but there simply was not enough to go around. Some workers began to supplement their rations with increasingly desperate measures, eating the corpses of the dead or even each other, reduced to cannibalism by the simple arithmetic of starvation. The orcs, observing this, found it all highly amusing. Humies were so weak, needing food and water to survive, dying when their soft bodies took damage that an orc would walk off. Some greenskins started keeping human prisoners just to watch them slowly waste away, making bets on how long it would take for the humies to die or turn on each other. It was entertainment, no different from the blood sports they enjoyed among themselves. As the weeks wore on, the Middle Hive descended into a special kind of hell. It was not the immediate terror of the initial invasion, but a grinding, exhausting horror where every day was a struggle to survive, where hope died a little more with each passing hour. the people who lived here. Those who had once had jobs and homes and families were reduced to scavengers and refugees, living in the ruins of their former lives. The PDF units that remained in the middle hive were a shadow of their former strength. Most of the troops were dead or deserted, and those who remained were exhausted and poorly supplied, low on ammunition and operating weapons that were falling apart from constant use. They fought on anyway, holding defensive positions that had no strategic value except to deny them to the Orks, launching counterattacks that achieved nothing except to buy a few more hours for the civilians to flee deeper into the hive. The Orks established control over large sections of the middle hive, creating fortified camps and sending out raiding parties to scavenge for supplies and fight. These Ork-held territories became forbidden zones for humans, places where venturing meant almost certain death. But they also became targets for the desperate or the brave, small groups of fighters who would infiltrate the Ork positions to sabotage equipment or steal supplies, or simply to kill a few greenskins before dying themselves. The manufactorums that the Orks captured were put to work producing crude weapons and vehicles. Human slaves, those unfortunate enough to be captured alive and deemed useful, were forced to labor alongside Gretchen under the supervision of mech boys. They worked brutal hours with minimal food and water, beaten if they slowed down, killed if they tried to escape. Some found ways to sabotage the production, introducing flaws into the weapons or vehicles that would cause them to fail at critical moments. Others simply endured, hoping to survive long enough to be liberated or to find an opportunity to escape. The battle for the middle hive dragged on, with no clear end in sight. The Orks controlled significant territory, but had not pushed the defenders out entirely. The PDF and militia forces, reinforced by house guards sent down from the upper levels and volunteers from the lower hive, maintained a tenuous hold on key sectors. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory, and so the war ground on, day after bloody day. The Underhive nightmare before the Orks came. The Underhive was already one of the most dangerous places in the galaxy. The lowest inhabited levels of the hive, abandoned by law and order, ruled by gangs and warlords who carved out territories in the darkness and defended them with brutal violence. The people who lived here were the dregs of society, those who had fallen through every social safety net or chosen to flee the oppression of the upper levels for the savage freedom of the depths. Now, with Orks rampaging through the levels above, the Underhive became something beyond nightmare. Refugees from the middle hive fled downward, seeking safety in the only place left to go, and found themselves in a realm where the only law was survival and the only currency was violence. The gangs who controlled the Underhive territories were not inclined to welcome these desperate newcomers with open arms. Some gangs demanded tribute, taking whatever possessions the refugees had left in exchange for safe passage or shelter. Others simply attacked, looting and killing the weak and enslaving the rest. But the Underhive had one advantage that the levels above lacked: its inhabitants were already used to violence and chaos. The Gangers who ruled these depths were hardened fighters, veterans of countless battles against rival gangs and the occasional PDF incursion. They knew how to fight dirty, how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to kill efficiently and without mercy. When the Orks came, they were ready. The first Ork units to penetrate to the Underhive did so by accident, breaking through weakened floors or falling down collapsed transit shafts. They found themselves in a dark, maze-like environment that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, lit only by flickering chem lights and the glow of toxic waste pools. The Orks, accustomed to straightforward fighting, were somewhat confused by this new environment, but they adapted quickly, as they always did. The Gangers struck first, ambushing the Orks with hit and run tactics that exploited their knowledge of the terrain. They would attack from the darkness, lasguns and autoguns blazing, then fade away into passages too narrow for the larger greenskins to follow. They set traps in the tunnels, crude but effective devices made from industrial equipment, and scavenged explosives that could bring down ceilings on unsuspecting Ork mobs or channel them into killing zones. where multiple gangs could focus their fire. The Orks responded by bringing in their own specialists. Commandos Orks, who possessed a rudimentary understanding of stealth and tactics, began to infiltrate the Underhive territories, moving with surprising quiet for their size and setting up their own ambushes. Blood Axe clans, known for being slightly more cunning than the average Ork, adapted human tactics and used them to fight the Gangers on more equal terms. The Underhive became a three-dimensional battlefield where combat could erupt anywhere at any time. Gangers fought Orks in cramped corridors and vast open chambers, on rusted gantries suspended over toxic sumps, and in collapsed domes where the ceiling had given way to reveal the levels above. The fighting was brutal and personal. Enemies close enough to see each other's faces, close enough to smell each other's blood. Some gangs made deals with the Orks, trading information about rival gang territories for weapons or the promise to be left alone. These collaborators were hunted down and executed by other Gangers when discovered, but the desperation of survival made strange allies. Other gangs fought with fanatical intensity, defending their territories against both Orks and refugees, seeing both as threats to their precarious existence. The most dangerous development was the emergence of feral Orks from the absolute depths of the Hive. During the Second War for Armageddon, 57 years before the current invasion, Ork spores had settled in the equatorial jungles and the lowest levels of the Hive cities. Over the decades, these spores had grown into feral Ork tribes, primitive even by Ork standards, living in the darkest depths and fighting each other in an endless cycle of violence.
When the new WH
began, the feral Orks felt it in their very bones, the psychic call to war that resonated through every greenskin. They surged up from the sump and the collapsed sectors, thousands of them, driven by instinct to join the fighting. These feral Orks were smaller and more primitive than their civilized cousins from the Space Hulk, armed with crude weapons made from scrap and bone, but they were no less dangerous. They knew the deep Hive better than anyone, and they moved through it with the confidence of creatures in their natural habitat. The meeting between the feral Orks and the newly arrived greenskins was brief and violent. The feral tribes attacked the newcomers, seeing them as rivals, but the civilized Orks quickly established dominance through superior size and firepower. Some feral Orks were killed, but most were absorbed into the larger army, joining the mobs that attacked the upper levels with the enthusiasm of greenskins, who had been deprived of a proper fight for too long. The presence of both feral and civilized Orks in the Underhive created a multi-layered threat. The civilized Orks established camps and fortified positions, using the Underhive as a base from which to launch attacks upward. The feral Orks ranged freely, hunting for enemies and loot, attacking anything that moved, whether it was human, Gretchen, or even other Orks if they looked weak enough. The refugees who had fled to the Underhive found themselves trapped between multiple dangers. Above them, the fighting in the Middle Hive continued to rage. Around them, gangs controlled territory with iron fists and were not interested in sharing their resources. And increasingly, Orks of both varieties prowled the darkness, hunting for sport and salvage. Some refugees managed to carve out niches for themselves, joining gangs or forming their own groups. Learning the brutal rules of Underhive survival, they scavenged for food in the refuse heaps, hunted the various creatures that inhabited the depths for meat, and defended their small territories against all comers. These survivors became hard and cruel, any softness or mercy a weakness that would get them killed. Others were not so lucky. Caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, they fell victim to Orks or Gangers or the Underhive's many environmental hazards. The toxic pools, the radioactive zones, the unstable structures that could collapse without warning, all claimed their share of victims. The Underhive's population swelled with refugees, then contracted as death claimed them, an endless cycle of arrival and demise. The deeper one went into the Underhive, the stranger and more dangerous it became. Mutants lurked in the absolute depths, creatures so twisted by pollution and radiation that they barely resembled anything human. These beings had adapted to the toxic environment, developing resistances to poisons that would kill a normal human instantly, but the mutations came at a terrible price in sanity and humanity. They attacked intruders to their territories with mindless savagery, and even orcs sometimes avoided the deepest zones, where the mutants congregated. Religious cults flourished in the Underhive, offering desperate people the comfort of faith in the Emperor, or, increasingly, promising salvation through the worship of darker powers. Chaos cults, long hidden in the depths, saw the invasion as an opportunity to expand their influence, offering real power to those willing to damn their souls. The Inquisition, if they had any agents on the planet, would have been horrified, but there was no one left to enforce orthodoxy in the Underhive. The Underhive had always been a place where the rules did not apply, where imperial law was a distant memory and survival was the only morality. The Orc invasion intensified these tendencies, stripping away any remaining pretense of civilization and reducing existence to its most basic terms: kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, survive at any cost. In the darkness of the Deep Hive, humanity showed what it could become when pushed beyond all limits, and it was not pretty. What the Orcs do to understand what life is like under Orc occupation, you must first understand what Orcs are and what drives them. They are not conquerors in any traditional sense. They do not seek to rule over human territories or exploit resources in a systematic way. They do not have grand strategic objectives or long-term plans for planetary governance. Orcs fight because fighting is their reason for existing, and everything else is secondary to that prime directive. When Orcs capture a sector of the Hive, their first priority is looting. Greenskins are obsessed with scrap and salvage, seeing value in the most unlikely objects. A broken lasgun, a piece of structural support, a damaged cogitator, random pieces of wire and metal, all of these are treasure to an Orc mechboy who can visualize how to repurpose them into weapons or vehicles or fortifications. Gretchen swarm through captured areas like locusts, grabbing everything that can be carried and hauling it back to Orc camps. The looting is not organized or systematic. Orcs simply take whatever catches their eye, often fighting each other over particularly shiny or interesting pieces of scrap. A single bolt pistol might be fought over by multiple Orcs, each convinced that they have the best claim to it, the dispute often settled through violence. The strongest Orc gets the prize, and the weaker greenskin either accepts this or gets beaten until they do. Captured manufactorums become Orc workshops almost immediately. Mechboys set up crude assembly lines where human slaves and Gretchen are forced to build weapons and vehicles under the greenskin's supervision. The working conditions are horrific even by Orc standards. The mechboys care nothing for safety or efficiency in any rational sense. Their workshops are death traps of exposed machinery and toxic fumes, accidents claiming workers daily. But the production continues, churning out the ramshackle weapons and vehicles that fuel the WH. Human slaves in Orc camps face a short, brutal existence. Those who are strong and cooperative might last weeks or even months, performing back-breaking labor under constant threat of violence. The Orcs beat slaves who work too slowly or make mistakes, and the beatings are often fatal, greenskin strength easily crushing human bones or rupturing internal organs. Slaves who try to escape are hunted down for sport, the Orcs enjoying the chase almost as much as the kill. Some slaves are taken for use in blood sports. The Orcs love watching fights, and they force their human captives to battle each other or face off against animals, or even Gretchen in makeshift arenas. These contests usually end in death for the humans, but the Orcs cheer and place bets regardless of the outcome. The few slaves who survive multiple fights earn a measure of respect from their captors, though this rarely translates into better treatment, just less immediate death. The worst fate is to be turned over to a painboy, the Orc equivalent of a doctor. These greenskin medics practice a form of surgery that combines genuine skill with complete disregard for the patient's well-being or comfort. Painboys experiment on human subjects, testing new medical techniques or cybernetic enhancements, their patients, rarely surviving the procedures. Those who do survive often wish they had not. Transformed into grotesque parodies of humanity, fitted with crude orc cybernetics that keep them alive, but in constant agony. Food for slaves comes from whatever the orcs do not want, which is not much because greenskins will eat nearly anything. Slaves subsist on scraps, and whatever they can scavenge when their captors are not watching, their rations barely enough to keep them alive. Starvation is constant, bodies wasting away even as the labor demands remain brutal. Many slaves simply die of exhaustion and malnutrition. Their bodies left where they fall until the Gretchen drag them away for disposal. The orcs themselves live in a state of constant low-level warfare even when there are no enemies to fight. Greenskins establish a hierarchy based entirely on size and strength, with the biggest orcs dominating the smaller ones through sheer physical intimidation. Arguments over loot or status, or perceived insults are settled with violence, orcs brawling in the middle of their camps with their fellows cheering them on. These fights rarely result in death, because orcs respect strength and will submit to a superior fighter, but they reinforce the social order constantly.
The arrival of a warrior
Brings orcs together under a war boss, usually the biggest and most cunning greenskin, who has defeated all rivals to claim leadership. But this unity is temporary and contingent. If the war boss shows weakness or fails to provide good fighting, challengers will emerge. The war boss must constantly prove their worth through successful raids and battles, demonstrating to their followers that following them leads to the best scraps. It is a form of leadership that only works for orcs, chaotic and violent, but surprisingly effective. War bosses organize the WH into warbands, groups of orcs united by clan affiliation or simple proximity. Each warband has its own boss, a nob who answers to the war boss, but has considerable autonomy in how they conduct their operations. These nobs lead their boys in raids against the Hive's defenders, competing with other warbands for the best fights and the most loot.
This competition drives the Noagi
forward, each warband trying to outdo the others in displays of violence and success. The orcs modify the areas they control to suit their preferences, which means everything becomes louder, more violent, and more chaotic. They tear down walls to create open spaces where they can drive their vehicles. They set up fighting pits for settling disputes and entertainment, and they construct crude idols to their gods Gork and Mork from scavenged materials. Orc camps smell of oil and sweat and blood, the air thick with exhaust fumes from poorly tuned engines, and the constant background roar of greenskin activity. Humans who encounter orcs quickly learn certain survival rules. Never run unless you are absolutely certain you can escape, because running triggers the orc hunting instinct, and they will chase you down for sport. Never fight unless you have no choice, because even the smallest orc is stronger than a human and will crush you in close combat. Never show fear, because orcs respect courage even in their enemies and might let you live if you face them bravely. And never, ever think that appealing to their mercy or reason will work, because orcs have neither. The psychological impact of living under orc occupation is devastating. Humans are social creatures who need some sense of order and predictability to function. The orcs provide neither. Their behavior is chaotic and unpredictable, driven by instincts and urges that humans cannot comprehend. You might be ignored one day and killed the next for no reason you can discern. This randomness breaks people, leaving them in a constant state of stress and fear that grinds away at sanity. But the orcs are not mindlessly destructive. They want the hive intact enough to be useful. They need the manufactorums functioning to produce more weapons. They want slaves alive enough to be productive. This creates strange pockets of almost normalcy, areas where human slaves work under orc supervision and life continues in a horrific parody of the way things were before. These zones are no less nightmarish than the areas of active combat, just differently so, the horror of routine brutality rather than immediate death. Surviving day to day for those trapped in an orc-invaded hive, every day is a struggle to survive, a constant calculus of risk and reward where the wrong decision means death. There are no safe zones, no areas where you can truly relax or let your guard down. The orcs can appear anywhere at any time, and even in areas not directly controlled by the greenskins. The threat of their presence looms over everything. Finding food becomes the primary obsession of anyone not actively fighting. The normal supply chains that fed the Hive's billions have collapsed completely. The agri combines that once provided the bulk of the food supply are either destroyed or in Ork hands. The food processing plants have been shut down or converted to produce Ork supplies. The distribution networks that moved food through the Hive no longer function. What little food remains is hoarded jealously by whoever controls it. Scavenging becomes a way of life. Groups of survivors venture into dangerous areas to search for supplies, rifling through abandoned hab units and ransacked supply depots, hoping to find something edible that has been overlooked. Competition for these resources is fierce, and scavengers must be constantly alert for rivals who might kill them for whatever they find. The Orks themselves are a constant threat during scavenging runs, their patrols ranging far and wide through the Hive. The food that can be found is often barely edible. Expired ration packs, moldy corpse starch, contaminated water. These become treasured finds. People eat things they would have considered disgusting before the invasion vermin caught in the hab blocks. Protein paste reclaimed from industrial processes. Even the bodies of the dead when starvation becomes acute enough. The line between human and animal blurs when hunger becomes the driving force of existence. Water is almost as scarce as food. The purification plants that made the Hive's recycled water barely drinkable are offline or producing contaminated fluid. Survivors learn to collect condensation from pipes, filter water through layers of cloth, boil it over fires made from scavenged materials. Even so, waterborne diseases become rampant. Dysentery and cholera sweeping through refugee populations and killing as efficiently as any Ork weapon. Shelter is another constant concern. The Hive's hab blocks, once overcrowded, now host even more people as refugees from the war zones seek somewhere to hide. Families might share a single small room with dozens of others, sleeping in shifts because there is not enough space for everyone to lie down at once. The lucky find intact, hab units in relatively safe areas. The unlucky make do with collapsed buildings and maintenance tunnels, anywhere that offers a roof and walls. Security is everything. Any shelter must be defensible, with barricades that can be erected quickly and multiple escape routes in case of attack. Survivors learn to sleep lightly, weapons close at hand, ready to flee or fight at a moment's notice. They set up watch rotations, always keeping someone awake to warn of approaching danger. Even children learn to be silent and vigilant, understanding that noise or carelessness can bring death. Medical care is almost non-existent. The Hive's few remaining doctors and medics are overwhelmed by casualties, operating out of makeshift clinics with dwindling supplies. Simple injuries that would have been easily treated before the invasion become life-threatening. A broken bone can mean a slow death if it becomes infected. A deep cut can bleed out if there is nothing to suture it with. Disease spreads unchecked through the crowded shelters, killing the weak and the very young. Some survivors turn to faith for comfort and strength. The ecclesiarchy's priests continue to minister to the faithful, leading prayers and conducting services in bombed-out chapels and street corners. They preach that this is a test of humanity's faith, that the Emperor watches and judges, that those who die in his service will be rewarded in the afterlife. For many, these words are all that keeps despair at bay. Others lose their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the idea of a benevolent God, Emperor, with the horrors they witness daily. They become nihilists, living only for the moment because they cannot believe in any future. Some of these lost souls turn to violence, becoming predators who prey on their fellow humans, because the Orks have shown them that might makes right. Others simply give up, sitting down and waiting for death to claim them. Communication with the outside world is limited or non-existent. The Hive's Vox networks are damaged and unreliable, most channels filled with static or carrying nothing but recordings of old broadcasts. Occasionally, a channel will crackle to life with a message from PDF Command or the planetary governor, promises of reinforcement and liberation that never materialize. These transmissions become less frequent as the weeks drag on, and eventually they stop altogether, leaving the survivors in silence. Rumors spread like wildfire through the refugee populations, stories of space marines coming to save them, of Imperial Navy fleets in orbit, preparing to bombard the Orks, of secret weapons being prepared to drive the greenskins off the planet. Most of these rumors are false, wishful thinking given substance by desperate hope. But they serve a purpose, giving people something to believe in, a reason to survive one more day in the hope that salvation is coming. The psychological toll of constant danger is immense. People develop a 1,000-yard stare, their eyes hollow and empty, their emotions blunted by trauma. They jump at sudden noises, flinch at shadows, cannot sleep without nightmares of green-skinned monsters. Children who have known nothing but war become feral and violent, lacking the basic social skills that peace would have taught them. The long-term mental health impacts will last generations, if anyone survives to worry about such things. Some people find strength in community, banding together with neighbors and strangers to create mutual support networks. They share what little they have, watch out for each other, and find comfort in not being alone. These communities can be surprisingly resilient, maintaining some semblance of normal social interaction even in the midst of horror. They celebrate small victories, mourn their dead, and try to hold on to their humanity. Others become isolated, trusting no one and hoarding whatever resources they can acquire. They retreat into themselves, speaking to no one, avoiding all contact with other humans. Some of these isolates survive longer than those who stay in groups, their paranoia and selfishness serving them well in an environment where trust can be lethal. But they pay a price in loneliness and lost humanity, becoming almost as much monsters as the orcs they hide from. The children suffer most acutely. Those too young to understand what is happening cry constantly, their distress adding to the stress of their caregivers. Older children try to help, taking on adult responsibilities far too young, scavenging for food or standing watch while their parents rest. Many lose their parents early in the invasion and must fend for themselves, forming gangs of orphans who survive through cooperation and ruthless efficiency. For the elderly and infirm, the invasion is often a death sentence. They cannot run from the orcs, cannot scavenge for food in dangerous areas, cannot defend themselves. They become a burden that many families simply cannot afford to carry. Some are left behind when groups evacuate, given what food can be spared and abandoned to whatever fate awaits. Others are cared for as long as possible, their families refusing to give up on them, even when survival would be easier without them. Sexual violence becomes another horror survivors must navigate. In the chaos of the invasion, with all normal social structures collapsed, predators emerge. Some men take advantage of the lawlessness to assault women, knowing there is no law enforcement left to stop them. Women and children are particularly vulnerable, and many survivors must balance the need for the protection that groups provide against the danger of trusting the wrong people. The orcs themselves are not generally interested in humans sexually. Their species reproduces asexually through spores. But their treatment of prisoners is brutal enough that survivors often prefer death to capture. The fear of being taken alive by the greenskins drives many to fight to the death when cornered, or to take their own lives rather than fall into orc hands. This fear is entirely rational, given what happens to those the orcs capture. Amidst all this suffering, small acts of kindness and courage stand out like stars in the darkness. A stranger sharing their last ration pack with a starving child. A medic staying at their post to treat the wounded even as orcs close in. A soldier holding a defensive position to buy time for civilians to evacuate, knowing they will die doing it. These moments of grace remind everyone that humanity is more than survival, that there is still something worth fighting for. The grinding war continues, weeks turn to months, and the initial frenzy of the invasion settles into a grinding war of attrition. The orcs have captured significant portions of the Hive, establishing control over entire sectors and using them as bases for further attacks. But they have not achieved total victory, and the Imperial defenders have not been completely driven out. What results is a stalemate, both sides holding ground and launching attacks, that achieve little except to add to the death toll. The PDF, what remains of it, has reorganized into something resembling an effective fighting force. The survivors are hardened veterans now, the weak and the unlucky long since dead. They know the Hive intimately, every corridor and junction, every strong point and fallback position. They have learned how to fight orcs, where to hit them to actually do damage, how to use the terrain to offset the greenskins' physical advantages. They are still outnumbered and outgunned, but they are no longer the terrified conscripts who faced the first orc assault. Imperial reinforcements trickle in, small units that manage to reach the planet through the orc blockade. A squad of space marines here, a company of guard troopers there. Never enough to turn the tide, but sufficient to provide crucial support at key moments. The space marines are worth their weight in adamantium, each one a superhuman warrior who can turn the tide of a small engagement through sheer prowess and firepower. Their presence bolsters morale among the defenders, physical proof that the Emperor has not abandoned them. The Astra Militarum regiments that make it to the surface are often specialized units. Urban warfare specialists who know how to fight in close quarters, heavy weapons teams who can bring devastating firepower to bear. Even a few sentinel walkers that can navigate the Hive's corridors and provide mobile fire support. They coordinate with the PDF, sharing tactics and equipment, teaching the locals tricks learned on 100 different battlefields across the Imperium. But for every Imperial soldier who lands, 10 more die in orbit or during the descent. The Orc blockade is formidable, the Space Hulk sitting in high orbit like a fortress, its weapons picking off troop ships before they can reach the surface. The Imperial Navy fights to maintain some presence in the system, their ships dueling with Orc vessels in a separate war that the ground forces can only watch from afar. The Orcs, meanwhile, continue to receive reinforcements from their Space Hulk. More rocks fall from the sky, each one carrying fresh mobs of greenskins eager to join the fight. The Orcs seem to have an inexhaustible supply of warriors, and indeed they might, as the spores they shed grow into new Orcs in the Hive's lower levels, creating a cycle where the greenskins can replace their losses faster than the Imperials can. Feral Orc tribes from the Underhive and the Ash Wastes are drawn to the fighting like moths to a flame. These primitive greenskins might not be as well equipped as their civilized cousins, but they add to the overall Orc numbers and create additional pressure on the defenders. The combination of fresh Orcs from the Space Hulk, feral tribes emerging from hiding, and the natural toughness of greenskins makes the Orc warrior a self-sustaining force that can replace its losses through natural biological processes. The fighting settles into a pattern. The Orcs launch assaults on Imperial positions, throwing themselves at defensive lines with their characteristic enthusiasm. The defenders repel these attacks with disciplined fire, falling back when positions become untenable, counterattacking when opportunities present themselves. Neither side can gain a decisive advantage, and so the war grinds on, each day bringing more death, but little change in the strategic situation. Entire sections of the Hive become no man's lands, contested zones where neither side has firm control. These areas are death traps, swept by crossfire, and littered with the bodies of those who tried to cross. Scavengers still venture into these zones, driven by desperate need for supplies, and some even manage to survive by learning the timing of patrols and the safe paths through the rubble. The Orcs establish a kind of economy in their controlled territories, trading looted goods among themselves and with the occasional human collaborator. Some desperate survivors make deals with the greenskins, trading information or labor for food and protection. These collaborators are despised by their fellow humans, and if the Imperials ever retake the lost territories, they will face execution for treason. But in the moment, survival outweighs honor for some. The Hive itself continues to deteriorate. The infrastructure damage from the initial invasion has never been repaired, and ongoing fighting adds to the destruction. Whole sectors collapse, their structural supports weakened by explosions or simply giving way under the strain of centuries of use. These collapses can kill thousands in moments, burying combatants and civilians alike under tons of rockcrete and twisted metal. Power becomes increasingly scarce. The Hive's generators are running on fumes, many of them damaged or diverted to provide power for defensive systems. Most civilians live without electricity, making do with chemical lights and fires for illumination. The darkness becomes oppressive, adding to the sense of isolation and despair that permeates the Hive. The toxic pollution that always plagued the Hive grows worse. Without functioning environmental systems, the air quality degrades and people begin to suffer from respiratory diseases and poisoning. The ash wastes outside the Hive, already deadly, become even more inhospitable as the fighting spreads fires and releases industrial chemicals. The planet itself seems to be dying, poisoned by the war being fought on its surface. Disease becomes a major killer, possibly claiming more lives than the fighting itself. Cholera, typhus, and other diseases spread through the crowded refugee shelters and military camps. The medical system has collapsed completely, unable to cope with the scale of the epidemic. Bodies pile up faster than they can be disposed of, and the survivors are too exhausted and sick to care properly for the dead. Morale among the defenders is a fragile thing, maintained through a combination of discipline, faith, and sheer stubbornness. The soldiers know they are probably going to die, that reinforcements are unlikely to arrive in sufficient numbers to change the strategic situation. That even if they win this battle, there will be another, and another until the Orks finally overwhelm them, or the Hive collapses entirely. But they fight anyway, because giving up means certain death and fighting gives them at least a chance. The Orks, conversely, are having a great time. This is exactly the kind of protracted scrap they enjoy: plenty of fighting, constant action, and worthy enemies who do not give up easily. The longer the war goes on, the stronger the Orks become, both individually as they grow from successful fighting and collectively as the Noah psychic field intensifies. What is a nightmare for the humans is paradise for the greenskins. The stalemate could last years if neither side receives significant reinforcements. The Imperials lack the strength to drive the Orks out, but they are dug in well enough that the greenskins cannot easily dislodge them. This kind of eternal war is unfortunately common in the Imperium, planets that become permanent battlegrounds where generations fight and die without resolution. The Hive world might be heading towards such a fate, becoming another Armageddon, another grinding war that consumes millions of lives in exchange for meaningless territorial gains. The toll on humanity, the psychological and spiritual cost of the Ork invasion, cannot be measured in casualties or lost territory. It is written in the eyes of survivors, in the way they flinch at sudden movements, in the nightmares that wake them screaming. The war has broken something fundamental in the human population of the Hive, a belief in safety and order that can never be fully restored. Trauma is universal among survivors. Everyone has lost someone: family, friends, comrades. Everyone has witnessed horrors that should never have been seen. The sound of Ork war cries, the sight of green skin, even the smell of their camps, all become triggers that can send survivors into panic attacks or flashbacks. There is no counseling, no therapy, no support system to help people process these experiences. They simply endure, carrying their trauma like an invisible wound that never heals. Children who have grown up during the invasion know nothing but war. They have no memory of peace, no understanding of what normal life was like. They have learned to identify Ork subspecies by sight, to recognize the sound of different weapons, to find cover and stay quiet when danger approaches. These are useful survival skills, but they come at the cost of childhood itself. These children will never be truly innocent, never be able to trust in safety or security. Some survivors develop a gallows humor, making jokes about the most horrific aspects of their situation. This is a coping mechanism, a way to find some control over circumstances that are otherwise overwhelming. They laugh at death and suffering because the alternative is to collapse into despair. This humor can seem cruel or callous to outsiders, but to those who share it, it is a lifeline that keeps them sane. Faith in the Emperor has paradoxically both strengthened and weakened. Some survivors cling more tightly to their beliefs, finding in faith the only comfort available. They attend daily prayer services, carry holy icons, and believe fervently that the Emperor protects and that their suffering has meaning. For these faithful, the invasion is a test, and they will be rewarded in the afterlife for enduring it. Others have had their faith shattered by the horrors they have witnessed. They ask why the Emperor would allow such suffering, why their prayers go unanswered, why innocent children die while Orks rampage unchecked. Some turn to heresy, willing to worship anything that might actually help them, rather than a distant corpse, God on terror. The Inquisition, if it ever arrives, will have much work to do purging the corruption that desperation has bred. The social fabric of the Hive has been torn apart. The old hierarchies no longer function. The noble houses are either dead or fled or barricaded in their towers. The administratum is non-functional, and the laws that once governed society are ignored or forgotten. What emerges is a more primitive social structure based on immediate utility and strength. Those who can fight or scavenge or provide other useful services rise to positions of influence. The old markers of status, wealth and noble blood mean nothing in the ruins. Gender roles have shifted in interesting ways. Women fight alongside men in the PDF and militia units, necessity overriding any cultural prohibition against female combatants. Many prove to be just as capable as their male counterparts, and in some units, women make up half or more of the fighting strength. This emergency egalitarianism might not survive if peace ever returns, but for now, anyone who can hold a lasgun and kill Orks is valued. Families have been shattered. Many children are orphaned, their parents dead or lost in the chaos. These orphans form groups for protection, the older ones taking care of the younger, creating makeshift families bound by necessity rather than blood. Some of these orphan gangs become surprisingly effective survival units. Their members fiercely loyal to each other and ruthlessly efficient at scavenging and fighting. The elderly and disabled face particular hardships. In a society reduced to survival of the fittest, those who cannot contribute physically are often left behind. Some families care for their elderly members, despite the burden, motivated by love or duty or simple decency. Others make the hard choice to abandon them, knowing that the resources needed to keep them alive could mean the difference between life and death for younger family members. Mental illness is rampant, but largely ignored. With no mental health services, and everyone struggling with their own trauma, those who suffer complete breakdowns are often left to fend for themselves. Some wander the ruins in a dazed state, living in their own internal worlds, ignored by others until they die of starvation or violence. Others become dangers to themselves or those around them, their minds unable to cope with the constant stress and horror. Substance abuse becomes a problem as people seek any escape from their reality. Alcohol distilled from industrial chemicals, drugs scavenged from abandoned medical facilities, even inhaling toxic fumes for their psychoactive effects, all become ways to numb the pain. These substances kill many users, but for some, a shortened life spent in a haze is preferable to full awareness of their circumstances. Domestic violence increases as the stress of survival strains relationships to breaking point. People take out their frustrations on those closest to them, lashing out physically when they cannot strike at the Orks, who are the real source of their anger. Women and children suffer disproportionately, and there is no one to protect them, no authorities to appeal to for help. Yet amidst all this darkness, human resilience shines through. People fall in love in the ruins, finding moments of connection and intimacy even when surrounded by death. Babies are born, bringing new life into a dying world, their parents clinging to hope that their children might see better days. Artists create, scratching drawings on walls or composing songs about their experiences, trying to preserve some record of what they have endured. The sense of community that develops among survivors can be powerful. People who were strangers before the invasion become brothers and sisters in arms, bound by shared trauma and mutual dependence. They celebrate small victories together, mourn losses together, and find strength in solidarity. These bonds can be deeper and more meaningful than relationships formed in peacetime, forged in the crucible of shared hardship. Some survivors find purpose in helping others. Medics who continue to treat the wounded despite having no supplies. Teachers who gather children and try to provide some education, teaching them to read and do mathematics even while bombs fall. Leaders who emerge to organize defenses or relief efforts, taking on responsibility not for personal gain, but because someone must. These individuals are the heroes of the invasion, ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity despite everything. The long-term impacts of the invasion will last generations. The survivors will carry their scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Their children will inherit the trauma, growing up in a society shaped by war and loss. The Hive itself, if it survives, will be forever changed, its population reduced, its infrastructure damaged, its social structures transformed. Recovery will take decades or centuries, if it is possible at all. Acts of resistance and hope. Not everyone submits passively to the Ork invasion. Throughout the Hive, individuals and groups fight back, their actions ranging from minor sabotage to full-scale military operations. These acts of resistance provide desperately needed victories for morale and demonstrate that humanity has not given up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Civilian militias form in areas not controlled by the PDF or House Guards. These are ad hoc units. Workers and refugees who band together for mutual defense and train themselves to fight. They lack proper equipment and training, but they make up for it with intimate knowledge of their local areas and a desperation born of having nowhere left to retreat to. Some militias focus on defensive operations, holding their sectors against Ork incursions. Others take the fight to the greenskins, launching raids on Ork positions to steal supplies or rescue prisoners. Sabotage becomes a weapon of the weak. Humans who work as slaves in Ork-controlled manufactorums find subtle ways to resist, introducing defects into the weapons they are forced to build, sabotaging vehicles so they will fail at critical moments, poisoning food supplies meant for the greenskins. This resistance is dangerous. If discovered, the saboteur faces brutal execution, but it is also effective. And the cumulative impact of thousands of small acts of sabotage degrades Ork effectiveness measurably. The Underhive gangs, while primarily concerned with their own survival, occasionally unite against the common enemy. When Orks threaten gang territories, the Gangers fight back with all their considerable skill and ferocity. Some gangs even make temporary alliances with PDF units, providing intelligence about Ork movements or participating in joint operations. These alliances never last long, but while they do, they can achieve significant results. Individual heroes emerge from the ranks of ordinary citizens. A Hab block enforcer who organizes his neighbors into an effective defensive unit and holds off Ork attacks for weeks. A child who discovers a cache of weapons and brings them to resistance fighters, enabling a successful counterattack. A medic who treats the wounded in the front lines, saving lives at great personal risk. These stories spread through the survivor communities, giving people hope and examples to emulate. The PDF units that remain effective become centers of resistance. These soldiers, most of them veterans now, launch carefully planned operations against Ork positions. They ambush supply convoys, raid Ork camps to free prisoners, and hold defensive positions that serve as safe havens for refugees. The PDF coordination is often poor. Communication between units difficult or impossible, but individual commanders show initiative and courage that keep the resistance alive. Space Marine involvement, when it occurs, can turn the tide of local battles. A single squad of Space Marines can clear an entire sector of Orks. Their superhuman abilities and superior equipment, making them worth hundreds of normal soldiers. But the Space Marines are spread thin, committed to multiple war zones across the galaxy, and they cannot be everywhere at once. When they do appear, they focus on high-value targets, killing Ork war bosses, destroying critical Ork installations, or holding vital choke points that control access to key areas of the Hive. The Mechanicus, if any tech, priests remain on the planet, work to keep the Hive's remaining infrastructure functional. They repair generators, restore water purification systems, and maintain the defense lasers that keep orc rocks from landing unopposed. This technical support is crucial to the defense effort, and the tech priests often put themselves at risk to perform emergency repairs in contested areas. Guerrilla warfare becomes the primary mode of resistance in orc-controlled areas. Small groups of fighters strike from the shadows, using hit-and-run tactics that exploit the orcs' tendency to charge headlong into combat. These guerrilla units avoid direct confrontation, instead focusing on wearing down the greenskins through attrition. They plant improvised explosive devices in routes the orcs use, snipe at greenskin patrols from hidden positions, and generally make occupation as difficult and costly as possible. Intelligence gathering becomes a critical part of the resistance effort. Spies and scouts infiltrate orc-held territory, observing greenskin movements and reporting back to PDF or militia commanders. This intelligence allows the defenders to anticipate orc attacks and position forces to counter them. It also identifies high-value targets for assassination or sabotage, warbosses whose deaths might fragment their mobs or weapon caches that can be destroyed to deny the orcs resources. Psychological warfare, while less effective against orcs than against human enemies, still has some impact. Loudspeakers broadcast messages claiming that an orc warboss has been defeated or that massive Imperial reinforcements are arriving. These messages are primarily meant to boost human morale, but they sometimes cause confusion among the orcs, particularly the less intelligent ones who might believe the propaganda. Acts of defiance, no matter how small, help maintain morale among the survivors. A graffiti artist who paints Imperial eagles and slogans on walls in orc-controlled territory, reminding everyone that the Imperium endures. A musician who plays songs of resistance in refugee shelters, lifting spirits with melody and lyrics of hope. A priest who conducts secret services in bombed-out chapels, keeping faith alive despite the horrors around them. Some resistance cells focus on protecting civilians rather than fighting orcs directly. They organize evacuation routes for refugees fleeing combat zones, establish hidden shelters where the vulnerable can hide, and coordinate the distribution of what little food and medicine remains. This humanitarian work is just as important as military resistance, preserving the lives that make victory meaningful. The resistance is not without its failures and tragedies. Many operations end in disaster, resistance fighters killed or captured by the orcs. Sabotage attempts are discovered, resulting in brutal reprisals against suspected collaborators. Intelligence gathering missions go wrong, leaving spies dead or worse. But for every failure, there are small successes, and these victories, however minor, keep hope alive. The ultimate goal of the resistance is not to drive out the orcs entirely. That would require military resources far beyond what the survivors possess. Instead, the resistance aims to survive, to maintain some kind of organized defense until proper Imperial reinforcements can arrive, and to make the orc occupation as costly as possible. If the greenskins can be bled enough, forced to commit more and more resources to holding the Hive, they may eventually abandon it for easier targets. The aftermath and the endless cycle, even if the Imperium eventually drives the orcs from the Hive, even if Space Marine chapters and Guard regiments arrive in sufficient numbers to break the back of the
WH!
Even if every visible greenskin is killed and the victory celebrations begin, the nightmare will not truly end, because orcs are not like other enemies. They cannot be completely eradicated once they have established a presence on a world. The fungal spores they shed ensure that new orcs will emerge, perhaps for centuries to come. The aftermath of an orc invasion is a long, grinding campaign to find and destroy every orc infestation before it can grow large enough to threaten the Hive again. This means years or decades of military operations in the Underhive, the ash wastes, and the ruins of destroyed sectors. Special units, like the Armageddon Orc Hunters, will need to be formed and trained, soldiers who specialize in tracking down and eliminating feral orc tribes in the wilderness. These genocidal campaigns are brutal and thankless work. Feral orcs are cunning and know their territory intimately. They hide in the deepest ruins, emerging to ambush patrols before fading back into the darkness. They set traps and use the environment to their advantage, turning the hunt into a deadly game where the hunters often become the hunted. Many soldiers die in these operations, killed by enemies they never saw coming. The survivors of the invasion face a long and difficult recovery. The Hive's population has been reduced, possibly by half or more, entire levels depopulated by the fighting. The infrastructure is in ruins, requiring massive investment to repair or replace. The social structures have collapsed and will need to be rebuilt, though they will never be quite what they were before. The psychological scars will persist for generations. The Imperium's response to the invasion will likely be harsh. Inquisitors will arrive to investigate potential corruption, looking for any signs of chaos influence or collaboration with the enemy. Those suspected of treason will face summary execution, and in the Inquisition's purges, many innocents will die alongside the guilty. The paranoia and brutality of these investigations will add to the suffering of those who survived the invasion itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus will want to study the Ork technology left behind, scavenging what they can from abandoned Ork camps and workshops. This will provide some economic benefit, as Ork tech, while crude, can sometimes be adapted for Imperial use or simply melted down for raw materials. But it also carries risks, as Ork tech sometimes has a way of malfunctioning catastrophically when handled by non-greenskins. Reconstruction will take decades. New hab blocks must be built to house the survivors, and whatever new population is imported to replace the dead. The manufactorums must be rebuilt and retooled, the power grid and water systems repaired, the defense networks restored and improved. All of this requires resources that the Imperium may or may not be willing to invest, depending on how strategically important the Hive world is judged to be. The cultural impact of the invasion will be profound. The survivors will tell stories about the war for the rest of their lives, and these stories will be passed down to their children and grandchildren. Heroes will be mythologized, their actions growing larger with each retelling. Villains will be remembered and cursed. The invasion will become a defining moment in the Hive's history, a before and after that separates the old world from the new. Some survivors will never be able to return to normal life. They will have been too changed by their experiences, too traumatized to function in a peaceful society. These individuals may join the Imperial Guard, seeking to channel their combat experience and trauma into service against the Imperium's enemies. Others will descend into the Underhive, becoming the next generation of gangers and criminals. Still others will simply fade away, unable to find purpose or meaning in the world after war. The children of the invasion, those who survived or were born during the conflict, will form a generation shaped by war. They will be harder and more ruthless than their parents, with different values and priorities. They may reject the old social hierarchies entirely, having seen how the nobility abandoned them to the Orks. They may embrace radical versions of the imperial cult, seeking meaning in religious extremism. Or they may simply be pragmatic survivors, focused on building lives for themselves in the ruins of the old world. The planetary government, if it survived in any form, will need to be reconstituted. The old governor likely died or fled, and new leadership will need to be appointed by the administratum. This new leadership will face the monumental task of rebuilding while managing a traumatized and potentially hostile population, all while meeting the imperial tithe demands that never stop, regardless of how much a world has suffered. The military implications are also significant. The Hive world's PDF will need to be completely rebuilt, trained, and equipped. Lessons from the invasion will be incorporated into their doctrine, hopefully creating a more effective fighting force for future threats. Defense infrastructure will be improved. Orbital defenses and ground-based anti-aircraft systems upgraded to prevent another space hoax from approaching so easily. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is that the cycle could repeat. The Imperium is vast and its enemies are many. The Orks could return,
bringing another WH40K.
in decades or centuries, or other threats might emerge: Terranid Hive fleets, chaos invasions, dark elder raids. The galaxy is a hostile place, and no imperial world is ever truly safe. The best the survivors can hope for is time, a few decades or generations of peace before the next apocalypse arrives. For the people who lived through the Ork invasion, who saw their world torn apart, and their loved ones killed, who fought and suffered, and somehow survived, life will never be the same. They have looked into the abyss and seen the face of the galaxy's brutality. They know, in a way that those who have never experienced war cannot, how fragile civilization is, how quickly order can collapse into chaos. But they also know something else. They know that humanity can endure, that even in the darkest moments, people can find the strength to resist, to fight back, to protect each other and preserve some spark of hope. They know that the Imperium, for all its flaws and cruelties, is all that stands between humanity and annihilation. And they know that the Emperor, whether as a god or simply as a symbol, represents an ideal worth fighting for. This is what it means to live on a hive world ravaged by orcs. It is a nightmare of violence and suffering, of loss and trauma, of fighting for survival in a universe that does not care whether you live or die. But it is also a story of resilience, of courage in the face of hopelessness, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they must. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also this humanity endures. Despite everything the galaxy throws at us, despite the orcs and the Tyranids and the forces of chaos and all the other horrors that seek our destruction, we endure. We fight. We survive. And sometimes against all odds, we even win. That is the lesson of the Ork invasion. That is the truth that the survivors carry with them. And that is why, even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, hope persists. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the horrifying reality of life on an Ork-ravaged hive world, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Your support helps me create more content exploring the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40k universe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you.